And we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Cara Augustenborg. Cara has spent over a decade working in academia in Ireland and the USA, conducting research and teaching in a wide range of environmental issues, from water quality to bioenergy and greenhouse gas emissions. She's passionate about environmental issues and the urgency of climate change. She appears regularly in the media, and she has been active with the Irish environmental NGO sector through Friends of the Earth and is current chair of their Europe's Executive Committee. She is also Ireland's first climate leader as part of Al Gore's Climate Leadership Corps, and has co-created a similar initiative in Ireland called the Cool Planet Champions. She's been appointed by the government to Ireland's Environmental Protection Agency and the newly created National Dialogue on Climate Action.
Thank you all. The clock is our enemy in more than one way, so I'll try not to keep you too long from your lunch. I entitled this talk "Govern the Clock," and this would be the clock that I'm following. And I was glad that one of our keynote speakers mentioned the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5 degree report. What this report was addressing was the Paris Climate Agreement sets out to keep the world below 2 degrees of planetary warming since pre-industrial times, well below 2 degrees, and in fact aspires to keep the world below 1.5 degrees. And actually, we've already warmed the Earth on average 1 degree since pre-industrial times. So prior to this report, many of us who were following the science were thinking possibly that we've even overshot 1.5, that our actions to date have put us on a trajectory of exceeding 1.5 degrees already. And this report came out to address whether or not that was possible. Could we actually stay below 1.5 degrees? The media framed this report when it came out last month as saying, we only have 12 more years to stay below 1.5 degrees, and that is true. You can see from the text here, it said we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. That's the 12 years that they came from. But actually, many of us took this as a hopeful message, which meant we still have 12 more years to try and achieve this target, that we haven't run out of time to stay below 1.5 degrees. So you can look at it both ways, but this is the clock that we now have to adhere to if we are serious about staying below 1.5 degrees. I will add that this report also looked at what are the impacts at 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, and it found that over 455 million additional people would be subjected to extreme heat waves if we reach 2 degrees instead of 1.5 degrees. That's just one of the impacts addressed in the report. Let's see if I can, maybe I can just advance this here. So we don't think about this when we're in Ireland. We maybe feel like we're not doing anything, and in fact, we're doing very little here, as you probably know. But there is hope globally, and I think it's useful to look around the world and see what is happening around the world to try and reduce emissions to this extent. We projected in 2000 that we would reach 30 gigawatts of wind power globally by 2010. The reality is that by 2016 we exceeded that by 16 times. So the projections for wind have actually exceeded what we expected. This is largely because the cost of wind has dropped considerably, and this is onshore wind costs, but offshore wind costs are also dropping dramatically too, and so places like the United Kingdom are moving entirely to offshore wind to kind of avoid the backlash of NIMBYism, people not wanting wind turbines in their backyards. So we're seeing more and more offshore wind, and in fact there are good news stories around the world. So for example, in Denmark, they met their wind power 104% on one day in April for a full 24 hours, entirely powered by wind. Our neighbors in Scotland in June of 2017 powered their entire grid by wind for the whole month. So this is already happening, and even in places like America, we know we have a climate denier in the White House right now. It hasn't stopped a number of cities from already moving to a fossil fuel-free energy system, and several cities have said across the country have said we are adhering to the Paris Climate Agreement. We are moving toward a renewable energy system. So the page has been turned on fossil fuels globally. The same thing with solar. I mean, we look outside here, and I often ask people, why do we not have solar power in Ireland? And people laugh and they presume it's the weather. Actually, we have 80% of the solar radiance of places like Italy, and we have an added advantage of natural rainfall that keeps those solar panels free of dust and dirt and keeps them operating efficiently. So there's no reason why we don't have solar power, and all of the roofs that you see out here don't have solar panels on them, except for a policy decision by government to not buy excess energy from homeowners and feed it back to the grid. However, across the world, this is already happening. So the projections for 2010 was that the solar market would grow by 1 gigawatt per year. In fact, that was exceeded 17 times by 2010, and now we're over 70 times. So the growth in solar, the rooftop revolution that's going on around the world is extreme, though we don't see it here, but you would see it in places like the continent. And this year they expect it to grow again by 77 times those projections. So you can see that the growth is exponential. This is largely due to countries like China, who are trying to move out of coal because of air quality issues with their population and health impacts, and move into solar, and of course see an opportunity to be the leaders in solar across the globe. But also places like Argentina, Chile, Southern California are building huge solar farms, and part of that is that the battery storage technology is improving and the cost of battery storage is improving, and that's allowing us to move to a renewable energy system far faster than ever projected. We know that the President of the United States loves his coal mines, but in fact, even in the United States, solar industry jobs now outpace coal. It actually takes very few people to operate a coal mine. It's mostly automated and robotic, whereas we know that renewable energy sector employs many more people, and so there's another added advantage to that. In fact, globally, the renewable energy sector is already employing 8 million people. There's a wonderful piece of research done by Professor David Conley when he was at Aarhus University called Green Plan Ireland that looked at if we transform Ireland to a fully renewable energy system and moved away from fossil fuels, what would be the impact on the economy? And he found that it would create 100,000 new jobs in this country, and of course remove our dependency, the 86 billion euro that we pay on foreign imports of fossil fuels too. So there are huge advantages to becoming fossil fuel free from a jobs point of view too. And we're now seeing a change in investment. So more and more investors are moving to investing in renewables rather than fossil fuels, and so we're essentially trying to decarbonize the economy and decouple from fossil fuel growth, which is why groups like Citigroup and Goldman Sachs are saying that the age of renewables is here. So again, it might not be apparent to us here in Ireland, but it is happening, and that is the hope that we can perhaps reach that 1.5 or stay below that 1.5 degree limit if possible. I was looking back, I was here last year speaking, and I was looking back at what I said, and at the time I think the current government had been in power about 18 months. We had some major victories. We'd banned fracking at that stage. We had the divestment bill, which is about to pass the Senate, hopefully this week, to divest our strategic investment fund from fossil fuels. So we had some good news stories, and we had the situation of new politics that was allowing legislation to go through the Dáil that had really never been passed before. Things like the fracking bill and divestment. I think Thomas Pringle, the independent deputy who brought the divestment bill forward, said, "It is only because of new politics that I was able to bring this bill to the Dáil." So it was quite an exciting time. We had the Citizens' Assembly who was meeting to consider how Ireland could lead on climate change. They had 2 weeks to consider this. It was quite unprecedented for them to take that much time to consider an issue, and it was a very democratic process, bringing together 100 people from around Ireland to really look in depth on this issue. So there were lots of promising opportunities, including the fact that Leo Varadkar, when he formed his cabinet, said that the very first issue he would look at was climate change. And for those of us who had seen previous governments kind of ignoring the issue and essentially saying Ireland was a leader in climate change when they weren't, this was also a message of hope. So we had this situation where the previous Fine Gael Labour government had established a national climate policy position in 2014. If you look at the fourth bullet there, it aimed as a fundamental national objective to achieve a transition to a competitive, low-carbon, climate-resilient, and environmentally sustainable economy by 2050, which is only 32 years from now. And Phil Hogan, the then Minister for Environment, defined a low-carbon society as a near-zero carbon dioxide emission society by 2050. So that's no fossil fuels emitted by 2050 in energy, buildings, or transport, completely electrical system, fossil fuel free, and carbon neutrality in agriculture, which means that any emissions from the agricultural sector would be sequestered in some way through forestry or better soil sequestration techniques. So that's quite an ambitious and very much in line with the climate science of what we need to do to address climate change and for Ireland to do our fair share. That was 2013, 2014. 2015, we had our first climate legislation, which would then require all government departments to stand before the Dáil and explain what they were doing on climate change. It would require the government to submit a national mitigation plan to say how we were going to address our greenhouse gas emissions. And it formed a government climate change advisory board, which is an independent group of experts that would advise the government in how to achieve these objectives. So there was a lot of opportunity for hope and everything. And unfortunately, the hope is there, but the action really isn't. So this is just a graphic of the amount of fossil fuel and renewable energy we're using in Ireland, including in the transport sector, which is the oil in red. And it's just that pink bar there is the only bit of renewable energy. So our energy, our electrical energy is about 25% renewable at the moment, but when you factor in oil from transport, we're only at about 10% renewable. So we're still a long way from this idea of a low carbon society when you simply look at how much fossil fuel we're using and the trajectory of our greenhouse gas emissions curves, which is increasing by 3.5% per year, while most of our EU counterparts are decreasing in line with their climate ambition and their agreements under Paris. So the proof is in the pudding, and as much as we can say we have all these wonderful national policy positions, the evidence certainly says otherwise. And if we're serious about climate change, the bottom line is we keep fossil fuels in the ground. That is the only way to address climate change. I mean, you can bring in agriculture and changing diet, and certainly all of those are contributors, but the core of this is we keep fossil fuels in the ground. And in fact, what we have is a Fine Gael-led government right now who is blocking the climate emergency measures bill that was put forward by Breed Smith from People Before Profit. That bill aims to end offshore oil and gas exploration. So, it addresses the fact that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And instead, we have a government that's saying, no, we need to keep extracting. We need to keep taking them out, even though Ireland has given away all our rights to that oil and gas. So our society would not benefit at all financially from that anyway. The Climate Advisory Council that should be providing advice to the government, they're mostly made up of economists and chaired by Professor John Fitzgerald of the ESRI. And every year they've been looking at the National Mitigation Plan of the government, and their language is getting stronger and stronger, saying to the government that the government's plan on how they are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is not sufficient to meet the 2020 targets or the 2030 targets. And if we fail to meet those 2020 targets, we will pay fines of up to 455 million euro for 2020 and orders of magnitude more than that for the 2030 targets. So I want you to keep this in mind, because the issue of carbon tax came up earlier, and I'll raise it again, but we will pay these. Taxpayers will pay these. They will pay this fine. Everyone will contribute to paying this fine. There will be no benefit. It'll go straight to the EU. It won't get rolled into any kind of energy savings or alleviating fuel poverty. And I think when Christine mentioned the lack of government communication on the carbon tax issue, this is the core of that issue, that we can have a carbon tax that we can design, that we can roll that money into alleviating fuel poverty, or we can pay a fine. But either way, we will pay, and that issue isn't being communicated to the public. I told you about the Citizens Assembly. This time last year, they considered the issue of climate change, and they had 2 weeks to discuss this, and they came up with 13 very interesting measures. They all agreed that Ireland needed to do much more to be a leader and do our fair share in climate action. But they had 13 recommendations, and the third one was that they said they themselves would be willing to pay higher taxes on carbon-intensive activities. So, they acknowledge a willingness to pay. When they consider the issue, they realize that actually, if we want to give people confidence that it's worth investing in energy efficiency measures, decarbonizing and switching to electrical sources of energy, we have to have a modest carbon tax that increases over time in order to give people certainty that it is worth investing in these technologies. And if we don't have that carbon tax, then it continues to make more economic sense for people to invest in fossil fuel technologies. And then we get this thing called fossil fuel lock-in, where somebody buys a new boiler and then they're committed to oil or gas for decades beyond that, when in fact that's the wrong direction that we need to go. Leo Varadkar met with the Climate Change Advisory Council even a week before the budget, and Christine mentioned the quote that he had, that we will have to grasp the nettle in increasing the carbon tax. So this was August, the Irish Times in August, even a week before the budget. The Climate Advisory Council had sat down with him and explained how they could have a carbon tax that could be designed in a way where the money would go to alleviating fuel poverty and helping people in low-income housing to retrofit their houses, reduce their energy costs, improve the quality of their buildings and their homes. So this can be designed effectively. And I think the problem with blocking a carbon tax or saying we are opposed to a carbon tax is what you get is a bad carbon tax, a carbon tax where the money goes straight into the exchequer, where the money doesn't get put into ways of alleviating fuel poverty. What you want is for the high users of carbon to pay and send money to the less well-off people who are using less carbon and help them create warmer homes and reduce their energy costs. And this is possible. An effective carbon tax is possible, but it requires people to engage in this to make sure it's designed correctly to address fuel poverty issues. The Climate Change Advisory Council was, I would say, devastated that at the 11th hour this plan for a carbon tax was rejected. Professor John Fitzgerald said, look, if we keep ignoring this issue, essentially the only solution we will have is to kill the entire herd, the entire livestock herd, to address our spiraling emissions. So, what we do now helps us not have to take such radical action later. I was really saddened when News Talk Breakfast asked him if he was considering stepping down from his position because of this announcement, and he said, look, I've been an ESRI economist for over 20 years. Every year the government asks me to look at the issue of a carbon tax, and every year I'm ignored. So at this stage, I'm used to being ignored. And I think what a sad state we are in, that our ESRI economists are continually being ignored, yet they're expected to continually put out this research. Joseph Curtin, who's also on the Climate Change Advisory Council, he is a policy analyst for the Institute for International and European Affairs. He said it best the day after the carbon tax: if Ireland, a small, relatively well-governed and wealthy economy with a wealthy country with a booming economy, can't deliver a miserable €10 increase in the carbon tax, that's raising it from €20 a tonne to €30 a tonne, which is equivalent to 3 cents a litre on the price of petrol. If they can't do that, one day after the IPCC report had released their 1.5 degree report, then we are truly doomed. A truly shocking and abject failure of political leadership. So this is our government-appointed Climate Change Advisory Council commenting on the actions of our government. It's not just happening at that level. Friends of the Irish Environment, a small NGO, has taken the government to the High Court now with a claim that the government is in breach of our human rights. And in fact, they have a statement from the UN Commissioner on Human Rights and Environment also saying that Ireland's actions on climate and greenhouse gas emissions are in violation of our human rights, and that is going through the High Court right now. If successful, Friends of the Irish Environment have asked that the government tear up their current national mitigation plan and create a new national mitigation plan that will actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with our international commitments. So at the same time, all of this bad news is happening. We have these strange ongoings within the sectors. So agriculture, obviously, it's 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland. We're very unique in that sense. Only New Zealand equals us in having a high-emitting agricultural sector, and that's because of our ruminant animals, largely our cows. So we have a national policy of what they call sustainable intensification, which is a bit of an oxymoron. And over the last 4 years, we've added 400,000 cows to our livestock herd. So each one of those cows is emitting more methane, and that is causing our greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture to continue to rise when they need to be going down. And yet, this summer, we had a drought and a fodder crisis, the second fodder crisis in recent years that really crippled farmers financially. And just this last week, there was a conference from the Irish Cooperative Organization or society, and you had Teagasc saying to the audience of farmers that they should really reflect on what didn't work in relation to this year's extreme weather in order to try and help them in the future. But this extreme weather is very much in line with climate projections. Livestock farming could get more and more difficult over time in Ireland, and our government policies on agriculture, this idea of sustainable intensification of the dairy herd in particular, are really out of line with what we're seeing in terms of the climate. So we have a huge issue here, and it's very upsetting to me, having come from, I did my PhD research in Teagasc, that really Teagasc's only objective now seems to be to answer ministers' questions. And of course, ministers are focused on short-term issues and on election cycles, and not to look at what the future of the Irish climate might be in 20 or 30 years' time, and how we can change our agriculture to be more food secure, to perhaps more diverse, and therefore at less risk of climate incidences like the fodder crisis. The similar issues and kind of contradictions are happening in transport. We have to fully decarbonize our transport system, so that means moving to all electric vehicles, and the government announced their Project 2040 plan that we would have no more new car sales of petrol or diesel vehicles by, I think, 2030, and that all sounds wonderful. Jim Gannon, the CEO of Sustainable Energy Authority Ireland, just in April of 2018 said electric cars are about to become the new normal in Ireland. Speaking of as one of the people who bought one of those electric cars and believed what Denis Naughton said when he told us that Ireland had some of the best charging infrastructure in Europe, I can firmly tell you that's not true. In fact, the charging infrastructure has been a disaster. Much of the charging infrastructure doesn't work anymore. It's not being maintained. And in fact, the Irish Times just recently said that the view on electric vehicles, it's all turbocharged hypocrisy. So sales are up, but unfortunately the infrastructure isn't there to support those of us who own electric vehicles right now. So there's they're speaking out of two sides of their mouth in many ways. On peat, in 1991, the government got advice from high-paid consultants when we signed on to the Kyoto Climate Agreement that if we wanted to reduce our emissions, we needed to stop burning coal in Money Point and stop extracting peat. It's our precious carbon sink. We're very lucky to have a carbon sink in the form of peat, and the worst thing we can do is extract it out of the ground. So that was 1991. We did nothing. In 2015, Burgh announced that they would end peat extraction by 2030. Many of us felt that was too late. As you know, we only have 12 years to address this, and so we should be starting now. So now, just recently, in the last couple weeks, Burgh has announced massive job losses, and the tragedy of this is that they have had decades to plan a just transition for these workers. And in fact, even if they had started planning this in 2015, they might be somewhere along the pathway of a just transition for these workers rather than just kicking them out into the coal. And so we're very fortunate to have Mary Robinson as a champion of climate justice around the world. And I think if you haven't seen her interview on the Late Late Show about a week ago, she came out very strongly on this issue of the need for a just transition for peat workers. And it's one of the first times I've ever seen her comment on national climate policy, and that intervention was very positive and exactly what we need right now is a just transition. The Green Party have a bill that they've just announced called a Just Transition Bill to try and support the workers, and it'll be quite interesting to see how the other parties react to this bill and whether or not they support it, but I very much hope they do. In January, when Leo Varadkar went to the EU and he used the words that he was not proud of Ireland's role as a climate laggard in Europe, in a way, many of us took that as some kind of success, that at least he had admitted failure, that we weren't doing enough. And I suppose it's a bit like an addict. The first step to solving the problem is to admit that you have it. So we hoped that this would be the step in the right direction. But unfortunately, I came here hopeful last year because of all of this language, and I come here now feeling a little bit fed up with rhetoric. I mean, his government has been in power for 2.5 years now, and we have really seen no signs of emissions reductions. If anything, we see a blocking of efforts like the Climate Emergency Measures Bill. So I'm less optimistic now than I was then. However, we have a new Minister for the Environment. Denis Naughton has left us, and Richard Bruton just last week made a speech at a climate kick, or a climate gathering on innovation around climate, and his language was once again very strong. I want to make Ireland a leader in responding to climate change, not a follower. Increasing carbon taxes will have a strong role to play. There are lots of language that is in line with what we would like to see if we are truly to move to a low carbon society. I saved these tweets for later, so I just screenshotted them so that I could go back and throw these back in his face if he doesn't adhere to them, but I very much hope that he does. And again, on the issue of carbon taxes, it's clearly not going away. The evidence suggests that it is the only way to really give investors and homeowners confidence to transition to that low carbon society. So I would encourage you to engage with it now to make sure that it is a just carbon tax that does alleviate fuel poverty, rather than just single-handedly objecting to it and having it designed in a way that doesn't help people in fuel poverty as it should. I just wanted to end by quoting Golda Meir, who's one of the most influential and important women of the 20th century. She was the first prime minister female prime minister of Israel, and she had the saying, "I must govern the clock and not be governed by it." So to reiterate, when we have 12 years to rapidly decarbonize, and what we do in that 12 years is essential. We're running out of time, and it's important that we hold the government to account to govern that clock and not be governed by it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cara. I suppose you could say that if rhetoric could solve the climate change, we'd be sorted a long time ago. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Questions from the floor? Yeah, Seamus, we'll start here. I can guess what this is about. I've got a mic there for Seamus first up here.
Thank you, Mick. I promised I wouldn't speak because I already did speak, but yeah, I don't know if you heard me earlier, but yeah, I was strongly, and my frustration is not that you are correct. Everything you say is absolutely correct. The reality around climate change is there. It's on our doorstep, so I have no problem, nor has my organisation, but we do represent what I would call a moderate, even left of centre, some people would say, form of rural communities. And we represent something like 1,200 rural communities. So we're not speaking because of a vested interest or because of any other interest. But the rhetoric also has to change from you. You can't just say, if we can't do a miserable €10 on carbon tax.
I didn't say that. That was Joe Curtin.
Well, whoever said it needs to stop saying that, because to a rural audience, that's just not understanding where they come from. And I'm not even talking about the agricultural world. The farmers can speak for that. I'm talking about communities. I'm talking about your example of Bord-na-Mona, for many people in rural Ireland, that's just the way things happen. At the last minute, at the last tick of the clock, we take the jobs out of the area and we have no solution to deal with it. And all Irish Rural Link are asking for around carbon tax is we have a proper adult discussion as to how that, as Richard Bruton says, trajectory of carbon tax will be managed. People think we've no carbon tax. We actually have.
Yeah.
There was one introduced in 2013.
Yeah.
Did we see any of that go back to energy issues? Did we see any improvement in rural transport? Did we see any renewable jobs in that area? So I'm afraid when I hear a man I hugely respect, John Fitzgerald, speaking, I don't hear him answer the question about how you manage, as Mary Robinson has put, the transition.
Yeah.
And we have no rhetoric, especially from the environmental movement, I'm afraid to say, around transition.
Yeah.
It must happen now, it must happen, and if you're disadvantaged by it, it's tough, but it must happen now. Well, yes, there's a case and there's a truth in that, but there's an equal truth in the fact that when you ask people, and we roll out with the SEI a program on refit houses, do you know it costs 20 to 40,000 to change your house? That's a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of money and low income, and there was another report out this morning saying that most jobs in the rural regions are precarious. We said this earlier in the program. So you're asking families with very low incomes to make a huge change without any understanding of how they're going to do that. Yeah. And all they want to know, as 250 people, and I'll finish with this, Michael, in the middle of summer, in Athlone, Friday evening, Irish Rural Link brought out 250 rural households on a Friday evening at 7 o'clock to try and learn about refitting houses, etc. Mm-hmm. So people do want to change, but nobody, including the environmental movement, are showing them how. And I really am frustrated, and that's why I'm so strong about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I knew this would spark dialogue, and which is why I brought it up. And I think it's important to have this conversation. First of all, I would say that when a big company pulls out of rural Ireland, right away the government sets up a task force for how to deal with those jobs. So why aren't they doing the same thing for Bord-na-Mona? Why didn't they do this in 2015? So to say people just go, oh, that's the way it happens, that's not usually how they react. The government usually reacts much stronger, so I would push that back on them. On the whole thing about the carbon tax, and the original carbon tax set up by, I think it was Green Party Fianna Fáil government, did put quite a bit of the money back into energy retrofit and alleviating fuel poverty. And then when the new Fine Gael government came in, they reversed it, so a majority of that money went back into the exchequer. So that is the real issue. The money absolutely has to go directly back into alleviating fuel poverty. And the point of the Climate Change Advisory Council, and Joe Curtin kind of alluded to this in some of his tweets afterward, was that they had designed it and explained it to Leo Varadkar on how he could get votes and how he could make sure that all the money from the carbon tax went directly back to alleviate fuel poverty, every single bit of it. The point of the carbon tax is to get people to reduce carbon use, especially the highest emitters. So and I completely take your point that the way it's been designed is that it's just money that goes into the exchequer, and it's a disproportionate burden on lower income and rural communities that are dependent on transport. So there has been a lot of work on just transition. I know Friends of the Earth has worked with SIPTU, and you don't feel that that's true?
No, they haven't worked with us. We've repeatedly asked them to things. My argument is strong. It's very strong.
Yeah.
As I said, I agree with almost.
And I agree with everything you're saying.
But
too.
my argument is, and when John Fitzgerald was on radio and I was listening to it, he was asked to explain what the alleviation would look like, and this you can listen back to it. His question back to Marion Finucane was, Marion, are we going to do something about climate change or not? In other words, he didn't answer the question. How do you alleviate the poverty?
Yeah, you have to bring that back to John. But the last thing I would say is, those fines will come out of everybody's pocket. So we have to tackle this. We can't just ignore it. It's going to happen.
Okay, could I take two? There's gentleman just down here and lady here. Yeah, just take the two of those together. If you'd like to go first, then we'll or shoot. You have the mic first. You go
Okay,
ahead.
I'll shoot very briefly. Just on the business of just transition, there's a very interesting model which has been agreed in the last couple of years between the Spanish trade union movement in the mining industry around how they did it. And there was a closure of a lot of mines in Spain, and a lot of people, transitioned. But they managed to do it very, very creatively, and it's a very interesting model of what can be done in just transition in terms of using sites for environmental purposes and involving the people who were being made redundant from the mines in alternative energy and a whole range of stuff. So it's the international trade union movement has quite a bit of stuff on the web about it, just if people are interested in that.
I would take this woman here,
Yes. Can the media do more to curb the spin that's emanating from the government? On the one hand, it was highlighted, Leo Varadkar stating that we were a laggard in Europe when it comes to tackling climate change. But people are not aware of the fact that in September he came out and welcomed the building of an LNG, liquefied natural gas terminal on the Shannon estuary using gas that's going to be imported, fracked gas from the States, which is going to release methane, which is a much more potent gas than carbon dioxide. And this terminal is to refine gas for export to Europe. So there's huge hypocrisy there. So can the media play a much greater role in just curbing the spin that's emanating from government?
Yeah, absolutely. For every measure that Fine Gael says that they're doing related to green measures and Green Week and everything, I can give you an example similar to yours where they're doing something to undo all that, and the media aren't asking the tough questions and they're not calling them out, largely because I think they don't know enough to know that this is happening, perhaps, or that all of these contradictions are going on. So there's a huge amount for the media to answer to in that. I would agree with you completely. I have seen a bit of a shift in the media and an improvement in coverage. Even the fact that they're not bringing climate deniers on is a big step in how they were even 5 years ago. So there's a kind of a marginal increase, but obviously not fast enough to address the pace of climate change.
Just take Donald Laird more. And could we take this one beside you there as well at the same time? I'm sorry, folks, once again.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. So, look, on the last three speakers even, I want to jump in there after Christine, but look, I respect the time. So, like, in reference to the well-being statement, it's all in line with modern management. Roll on to Tony reference, just my own take on the sense of security associated with home ownership, like the holistic perspective. We haven't even looked at that. For the individual being a productive person, the knock-on for societal, the strategic approach to this to achieve what I referenced earlier, even be it mental health, the UN Convention, and so on. And like you turn over to Cara's input then in relation to these prospective fines, the 2020, 2030, if we're failing. I mean, there's Tony's social housing out the window straight away. So it really is incumbent upon all of us that are the likes of these settings, to come out vocal and strong. And I think Social Justice Ireland can play a significant role in that, and hopefully we can present as a sense of unity coming out of it. Thanks, Mike.
Just take this woman here as well at the same time. Go on.
Thank you. And thanks very much, Cara, for the input. And I think it's really refreshing that we now are having the debate here on how we respond to climate change, because I think working on climate for a number of years, often we end up in the awful discussion of should we or how far should we. So I think the debate around what does a just transition look like is really, really refreshing. In an international context, which Trócaire is working in, we've seen climate change as one of the highest priority issues because of the devastating impact it's having on the most vulnerable communities, at the same time that we need to tackle poverty and injustice. So I think the how we respond to climate change is really, really important, and it's great that is coming out. My question, very briefly, is in terms of the 12 years, I think it is, as you say, maybe heartening to hear that it's not too late to stay within 1.5 because of those devastating impacts on the world's poorest. But I wonder, in terms of the messaging, is there a danger that people think, we've got 12 years, we've got plenty of time, as opposed to the urgency of the transition that's needed from now?
Yeah.
I just hold your car. Just take one. This man here, I think, was waiting a while. I'm sorry, I'm really against the clock here. Just hear this and then let you.
How's it going? Dermot from the National Youth Council. And I'm sitting here wondering, after the last two presentations, do we need to talk about the just transition from youth to adulthood? Because young people we're asking them to project their imagination into the future, and it's bleak. So my question is, how important are young people to the future in terms of climate change?
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So just to address Neo's comment there on the 12 years, I mean, I think the IPCC was quite optimistic in this report, more optimistic than I'd seen them, and in a way it was to give us that little bit of hope, to not say it's too late, because if it's too late, then why bother doing anything? But 12 years isn't much time, particularly to decarbonise by 45% is what they're saying. That's rapid decarbonisation, and as I said before, Ireland is increasing emissions at 3.5% per year rather than decreasing. So, you know, we have 12 years to get down 45, 50%. That's huge. So it's really not enough time. And on the youth issue, I often worry when I see youth initiatives on climate change, because I think the government's trying to kind of push it on to the next generation. Oh, if we educate the youth, they'll do something about it. So I think it's very important that we educate our generation and we take the action and not leave it to the next generation. And I see the youth, when I talk to young people, that they see sustainability and the low carbon transition as an opportunity. It's an opportunity for jobs in this country, the whole sharing economy that we, you know, on our phones now, that we can share everything. This is an opportunity for new entrepreneurship and apps. So they see the transition as an opportunity, and the frustration is that the government isn't paving the way for that transition. So I think it could be a positive thing for them if we only took that action now.
Just time, final comment there, Sean.
Just to, this one is okay. Just to finish on a very small positive note, because I'm very conscious of the bleakness of all of this, and it's this. I know Seamus has been strong this morning, but in both sessions in which he spoke. But Irish Rural Link and Social Justice Ireland have now planned to partner a direct approach to the Department of Finance, because of our engagement with the Minister twice in the build-up to this particular recent budget, in which he seemed to miss the point about mitigation on the issue of carbon tax. And what we're simply going to say is we are prepared to put our resources and work with them to generate for the next budget an outcome that an audience like this would consider to be just. In other words, that we can see progress on the carbon side, but that we have to see direct ongoing mitigation put into place and not sort of dismissed out of hand or saying we'll deal with it at some point. So we will partner together, the two organizations. We bring, I think, a fair bit of capacity, both in terms of rural spread and research capacity, and we'd hope to have some kind of impact on the Minister's view of this by this time next year.
That's
wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, and on that positive note, please, could you thank very much for a very interesting presentation from Cara Augustenborg. Thanks a million.